The word landed in the center of the polished mahogany table and lay there, a dead thing between the crystal wine glasses and the gleaming silverware. Failure. Clara hadn't shouted it. She had delivered it with the calm, surgical precision of a pronouncement, a final diagnosis for a terminal condition. It was a statement of fact as she saw it, no more debatable than the Chardonnay being chilled or the roast beef being overcooked. Across the table, her father, Richard Davenport, a man whose tailored suits seemed to be woven from pure, unadulterated condescension, gave a slow, deliberate nod. Her mother, Eleanor, adjusted a pearl earring, her silence a sharp, ringing endorsement. Her brother, Marcus, simply smirked into his napkin, the picture of smug satisfaction. Alexander Vance, the subject of this familial verdict, did not react. He simply looked at the word as if it were a physical object, something he could pick up and examine. A failure. Was that what he was? He had lost his job 2 days ago, a senior architect at a firm that built monuments to vanity, all glass and steel and soulless ambition. He hadn't been fired for incompetence, but for integrity, a distinction that was utterly lost in this room. He had refused to sign off on structural plans that cut corners, that prioritized profit over the lives of the people who would one day inhabit the building. For that, he was shown the door. For that, he was a failure. He felt the familiar weight of his leather-bound moleskine notebook in his jacket pocket. It was a simple, unassuming object he'd carried for years, its pages filled with sketches, equations, and ideas that were his and his alone. It was the only part of him that felt truly authentic in this gilded cage of a life. His gaze drifted from Clara's perfectly composed face, with its cold, beautiful geometry, to the opulent dining room around them. Everything was a reflection of the Davenport creed. Success was not something you earned. It was something you displayed. It was the heavy silk curtains, the ridiculously oversized chandelier that dripped crystal light, the ancestral portraits of stern-faced men who had built their fortunes on the backs of others. He had married into this world, believing he could navigate it, that Clara's love for him was separate from her family's obsession with status. He had been wrong. The last 5 years had been a slow, grinding erosion of his sense of self, a constant, unspoken demand to be more, to earn more, to become someone worthy of a Davenport. And now, with the loss of his prestigious job, he had broken the unspoken contract. He had failed to maintain the facade. "Well, Alex." Richard's voice was smooth, like aged whiskey, but with a bitter aftertaste. "Nothing to say for yourself? I warned Clara you didn't have the killer instinct. You're too thoughtful. In our world, thoughtful is just a polite word for slow. What are your plans, Alex?" Eleanor asked, her tone suggesting she was inquiring about a household pest. "You can't simply sit around. It's embarrassing. What will we tell the Hendersons?" Alex finally lifted his eyes and met his wife's. There was no sympathy there, no partnership, only disappointment, as if she had invested in a stock that had just plummeted. "I'm working on it," he said, his voice even, betraying none of the storm raging inside him. Clara laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Working on what? Your little doodles in that notebook?" "Alex, be serious. My father has offered to find you a position, something in middle management at his company. It's humiliating, but at least it's a paycheck. At least you won't be a complete and utter failure." And there was again the word. This time it stung. He saw his entire future with her spooling out before him, a life of quiet desperation, of being the family charity case, the cautionary tale whispered about at cocktail parties. He would be the man who had the chance to be a Davenport by association and had fumbled it. He picked up his wine glass, the stem cool against his fingers, and looked at the 4 faces staring back at him, a tribunal of judgment. They thought this was his end. They thought this was the moment he broke. They had no idea it was the moment he was being forged. I hope you're settling in, because this is a story about how the quietest man in the room can make the loudest noise. It's about the difference between what things look like and what they really are. If you enjoy stories where the underdog doesn't just get a win, but completely rewrites the rules of the game, then you're in the right place. Do me a favor and hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories just like this one. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to that dinner and the 18 months that followed. An 18-month fuse burning its way toward an explosion no one but Alex saw coming. He placed the glass back down without drinking from it. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The humiliation was a fire, but instead of consuming him, it was burning away the fog. He saw them for what they were, hollow. Their power was derived from a shared illusion of superiority, a fragile construct built on money and scorn. He had spent years trying to earn the approval of people whose approval wasn't worth having. "Thank you for the offer, Richard," Alex said, his voice a low, steady hum that cut through the tension. "But I won't be needing it. I have my own plans." Marcus snorted. "Plans? What? Are you going to build a birdhouse? Maybe you can sell them on Etsy." The table chuckled. It was the easy, cruel laughter of a pack that had cornered its prey. Alex didn't smile. He simply met Marcus's gaze. "Something like that," he said softly. The statement hung in the air, simple, devastating in its quiet defiance. He was no longer playing their game. In that moment, surrounded by the four people who were supposed to be his family, Alexander Vance became invisible to them. They looked at him, but they didn't see him. They saw a failure, a disappointment, a man to be pitied and managed. They had no idea they were looking at the architect of their downfall. The meal continued, a pageant of arrogance and dismissal, but Alex was no longer there. He was already somewhere else, sketching the foundations of his new life on the grid pages of his mind. The fuse had been lit. The drive home was a symphony of silence. Clara sat in the passenger seat of their shared luxury sedan, a car her father had gifted them for their wedding, a fact she never let Alex forget, and stared out at the blurred city lights. It wasn't a comfortable silence, the kind shared by two people who know each other so well that words are unnecessary. It was a weaponized silence, a cold, heavy blanket of disapproval meant to suffocate him. Every turn of the wheel, every red light, stretched the tension thinner. Alex could feel her judgment radiating from her like heat from asphalt. He had failed the test. He had not been suitably contrite. He had not groveled. He had not gratefully accepted the scraps from her father's table. Instead, he had offered quiet defiance. And, to the Davenports, defiance from a subordinate position was the ultimate sin. When they finally pulled into the garage of their minimalist, architect-designed house, a house Alex himself had designed, another fact that was conveniently forgotten, Clara turned to him. The garage light cast harsh shadows across her face, making her look like a marble statue, beautiful, perfect, and utterly cold. "I've never been so embarrassed in my entire life," she said, her voice low and tight. Alex turned off the engine. The only sound was the faint ticking of the cooling metal. "Why?" "Because I didn't let your father treat me like a child. Because you acted like one. I have my own plans." "What plans, Alex? What could you possibly be planning from the couch? You have no job, no prospects. You threw away a six-figure salary and the respect that came with it. For what? Some misplaced sense of integrity? Integrity doesn't pay the mortgage. This house is paid for, Clara," he reminded her gently. He had used the inheritance from his parents, two humble teachers who had valued books over bonds, to buy it outright before they were married. It was his. Another inconvenient detail. She waved a dismissive hand. "That's not the point. It's about appearances. It's about momentum. My family built their reputation by never, ever taking a step backward. You just leaped off a cliff. And you expect me to be happy about it." He finally looked at her, and for a fleeting second, he tried to find the woman he had fallen in love with, the vibrant, witty arts student who had once claimed to despise her family's shallow materialism. He couldn't find her. She was gone, replaced by this perfect, polished vessel of their values. "I expected you to be my wife," he said. "I expected you to stand with me, to trust me, or at least to ask me what my plans are before your family wrote me off." "Oh, I know your plans," she scoffed, opening her door. "You'll mope around for a few weeks, work on your portfolio, and then you'll come crawling to my father, and I'll have to clean up this mess." She got out of the car, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete. "Don't wait up. Alex sat in the silence of the garage for a long time. He pulled the moleskine from his pocket and laid it on the steering wheel. He ran his hand over the worn cover. This was his real portfolio. Inside were not just doodles, but fully formed concepts for sustainable urban living, designs for buildings that breathe, that generated their own power, that integrated nature into their very structure. These were the ideas his old firm had called unprofitable pipe dreams. These were the ideas he had been told to abandon in favor of another glass box, another concrete tower. He had lost his job because his boss, a man named Henderson, the very man Eleanor was worried about facing, had stolen one of his preliminary concepts and presented it as his own. When Alex had confronted him, not with anger, but with quiet, documented proof, Henderson had engineered his dismissal, framing it as a layoff due to creative differences. Alex hadn't told Clara the details. He had wanted to see what she would do, who she would be, when faced with his apparent failure. Now, he had his answer. He started the car again, but instead of pulling into the garage, he backed out onto the street. He didn't drive toward the city center, but toward a quiet, industrial part of town he'd been visiting for months. He pulled up to a nondescript brick building, a former textile mill, and used a key to open a heavy steel door. Inside was not a dusty, abandoned space, but a clean, brightly lit, open-plan office. It was sparsely furnished, a few desks, some high-end computers, a large plotter, and a wall covered in corkboard. Pinned to the board were detailed schematics, renderings, and financial projections. In the center of the room, a stunningly detailed architectural model sat on a large table, a miniature city of elegant, futuristic buildings. A simple laser-etched sign on the far wall read, Ethelred Designs. He had started the company 6 months ago, using the last of his inheritance. He had been working here every night after leaving his old job, laying the groundwork, refining his designs, building the business plan. He told Clara he was at the gym or working late on the Henderson project. The name, Ethelred, was a private joke. It meant noble counsel in Old English, but he was more drawn to one of its famous bearers, Ethelred the Unready, a king who was called Unready not because he was unprepared, but because he was ill-advised. Alex felt a kinship with him. He had been ill-advised for years, listening to the wrong people, seeking the approval of a court that didn't value what he had to offer. No more. He walked over to the model, his creation, and gently touched the top of the central spire. It was a bold, ambitious project, a complete reimagining of a derelict waterfront district. It was his answer to the soulless architecture he'd been forced to practice. It was his plan, and it was already in motion. He had a meeting tomorrow morning with an investor, a man who didn't care about family names or prestigious firms, only about vision. Alex felt the weight of Clara's words, of her family's scorn, begin to lift. They thought he was on the couch. They thought he was defeated. They had no idea he was already building a new world. 3 months melted into a season of quiet progress and escalating contempt. For Alex, the days were a disciplined rhythm of work. He would leave the house early, dressed in casual clothes that Clara took for the uniform of the unemployed, and drive not to a coffee shop to mope, but to the anonymous brick building that housed Ethelred Designs. He had hired a small, brilliant team, a young structural engineer who shared his passion for sustainable materials, and a veteran project manager who had been forced into early retirement by a corporate merger. They were a lean, hungry trio, fueled by coffee and a shared belief in the vision taking shape on their screens and in the 3D printer that hummed in the corner. The initial investor meeting had been a success. A shrewd, self-made real estate developer named James Sterling, a man who saw genius where others saw risk, had been captivated by the Helios project, as Alex had named it. Sterling hadn't just offered seed money. He'd offered a partnership, opening doors to city planning officials and environmental agencies that would have been closed to Alex alone. The project was moving forward, slowly, secretly, but with unstoppable momentum. At home, the atmosphere grew colder. Clara treated him with a kind of weary, disappointed patience that was far more insulting than outright anger. She had accepted her father's narrative. Alex was a lost cause, a man adrift, and it was her burden to bear him until he came to his senses. This narrative was reinforced at every family gathering, which seemed to increase in frequency, as if designed to highlight Alex's fallen status. The second major humiliation came at Richard's 60th birthday party. It was a lavish affair held at their country club, a place where wealth wasn't just displayed, it was the very air one breathed. Alex stood by the French doors, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, feeling like an anthropologist studying a strange, alien tribe. There you are. Marcus, Clara's brother, slapped him on the back a little too hard. Marcus was a man who had glided through life on a cushion of his father's money and influence. He had just been made a vice president at Davenport Industries, a promotion celebrated with a toast that conveniently omitted the fact that the previous VP had been abruptly fired to create the opening. Hiding the corner, don't blame you. Tough crowd when between things. I'm not between things, Marcus, Alex said calmly. I'm starting something. Marcus chuckled, taking a large gulp of champagne. Right. The little project Mom told us. Listen, Alex, there's no shame in it. Lots of guys have hobbies. Woodworking, model trains, your thing is drawing pretty buildings. Goo. But at some point, you've got to get back in the real world. For Clara's sake, if not your own. Just then, Richard and Eleanor joined them, their faces flushed with social victory. Alexander, Richard said, his use of Alex's full name a clear power play. Marcus tells me you're still pursuing your artistic endeavors. Wonderful. It's important to stay busy. But Clara mentioned you're burning through your savings. You need to be practical. I meant what I said about finding a place for you. I could have you in a cubicle by Monday. You'd have a title. Benefits. It would give you a sense of purpose. The condescension was breathtaking. They spoke as if he weren't there, a problem to be solved, an object to be placed in the correct box. They saw his calm as weakness, his lack of panic as a sign of delusion. Thank you, Richard, but I have a purpose, Alex replied, his eyes steady. Of course you do, Eleanor chirped, patting his arm as if he were a distraught child. We just worry. It's a terrible strain on a marriage when the man isn't providing. We just want what's best for Clara. The message was clear. He was failing her. He was a burden. He was letting down the side. He excused himself and walked out onto the terrace overlooking the golf course. The manicured perfection of the green felt oppressive. He took a deep breath of the cool night air and pulled out his phone. He had an email from his lead engineer. The subject line was Phase 2 Geotechnical Surveys. Better than expected, he opened it. The data was good. The ground beneath the derelict waterfront was solid bedrock, perfect for the deep foundations his designs required. It would save them millions and months of work. A small smile touched his lips. They were in there, talking about cubicles and benefits, trying to save him from his own imagined failure, while he was standing out here, holding the key to transforming a forgotten piece of the city. He could hear their laughter through the open doors, and for the first time, it didn't sound menacing. It sounded distant, irrelevant. He typed a quick reply to his engineer. Excellent news. Let's accelerate the environmental impact assessment. Full steam ahead. He put the phone away. Let them have their party. He had a city to build. The months wore on, and the chasm between Alex's two lives widened. His days at Ethelred Designs were electric. The Helios project was no longer just a concept. It was a living, breathing entity with permits, timelines, and a growing budget funded by a consortium of investors Sterling had brought to the table. They had secured the land rights through a series of shell corporations to avoid speculation, a move Sterling had insisted upon. The team had grown. They now occupied the entire floor of the old mill, the space filled with the low hum of servers, the murmur of collaboration, and the scent of possibility. Alex was in his element, not as a mere architect, but as a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony of engineering, finance, and urban planning. He was respected. His vision was the guiding star that everyone followed. Then he would go home. He would walk through the door of his silent, sterile house, and the energy would drain out of him. He was no longer the visionary leader of a Helios project. He was Clara's failed husband. The third and most brutal humiliation was not a public spectacle. but a private, soul-crushing confrontation. It was a Tuesday evening, a year into his new venture. He had just returned from a clandestine trip to Germany where he had finalized a deal with a cutting-edge manufacturer of photovoltaic glass, a core component of his sustainable design. He was exhausted but exhilarated. The final piece of the technological puzzle was in place. He walked into the living room to find Clara sitting on the white leather sofa, an array of pamphlets and brochures spread out on the glass coffee table before her. "Where have you been?" she asked, not looking up. Her voice was flat. "I had to go out of town for a couple of days." "For a meeting," he said, keeping his explanation vague as always. She finally looked up, and her eyes were filled with a cold fire he had never seen before. "A meeting for what, Alex? For your fantasy project? I am done. I am done with the lies, the evasiveness, the embarrassment. It's not a fantasy, Clara, isn't it?" She stood up and walked toward him, her movements stiff with rage. "I ran into Susan Henderson today, at the club. She asked how you were. She said her husband felt so bad about having to let you go, but that you just weren't a team player. Do you know how that feels? To stand there and smile and pretend my husband isn't sitting at home all day in his sweatpants, drawing pictures." The injustice of it was a physical blow. Henderson, the man who had stolen his work, was now painting himself as the benevolent, long-suffering boss. And his wife, Alex's wife, had accepted that version without question. "That's not what happened, and you know it," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What I know is that my husband is unemployed," she shot back, her voice rising. "My friends' husbands are closing deals, getting promotions, buying vacation homes. You are doing nothing. I have stood by you for a year. I have endured the pitying looks from my family, the whispers from my friends. I have defended you, but I can't do it anymore. It's over." She gestured to the coffee table. The brochures were for job placement agencies, high-level corporate headhunters. "My father has arranged interviews for you, at his company and 2 others. Real jobs, Alex, with a future. You will call them tomorrow. You will put on a suit, and you will go get a job. And you will shut down this pathetic little hobby of yours. If you don't," she paused, letting the threat hang in the air, "then we're going to have a very different conversation about the future of this marriage." It was an ultimatum, a command. "Kill your dream, or I will leave you." He looked at her, at the woman who was supposed to be his partner, his confidant. She wasn't asking him to succeed. She was ordering him to conform. His success had to look a certain way. It had to be on her terms, approved by her family. Any other path was a deviation, an act of rebellion to be crushed. The exhilaration from his trip to Germany evaporated, replaced by a profound, chilling sadness. He had held out hope, a tiny, flickering ember, that she might eventually see him, that she might trust him. But now he saw the truth. She didn't want him to succeed. She wanted him to be manageable. He felt the familiar outline of the moleskine in his jacket. It felt like an anchor in the storm. Inside, it was the genesis of a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a project that would reshape the city skyline and set a new global standard for sustainable development. And here, in his own home, he was being ordered to go for a job interview for a mid-level marketing position. The absurdity of it was almost comical. "I won't be doing that, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of anger, full only of a quiet finality. Her eyes narrowed. "Is that your final answer?" "It is." She picked up her purse from the counter. "Fine. I'm going to my parents. I need to be around people who understand what's important in life. You can stay here, in this house you paid for, with your precious doodles. See how far they get you." She walked out, the front door closing with a soft, definitive click. Alex stood alone in the silent house. The ultimatum had been delivered. The lines had been drawn. He walked over to the window and watched her car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel panic. He felt free. The last chain had been broken. He took out his phone and called James Sterling. "James," he said, "it's time. I want to move up the launch announcement. How soon can we put together the press conference?" There was a pause on the other end, and then Sterling's deep, rumbling laugh. "I was wondering when you'd get tired of playing secret agent, Alex. Give me 48 hours. The world is about to meet Ethelred Designs. The final 6 months leading up to the 18th month mark were a blur of controlled, clandestine activity. Alex moved out of the house he had shared with Clara, telling her via a brief, formal email that he needed space. He rented a small, furnished apartment near the Ethelred Designs office, a Spartan place that was little more than a place to sleep. His life became his work. The house, his beautiful, minimalist creation, sat empty, a monument to a life he had already left behind. Clara didn't fight him on the separation. To her and her family, it was the logical, pathetic conclusion to his downward spiral. The failure had now failed at his marriage, too. They pitied him, and in their world, pity was the final nail in the coffin of a man's reputation. They were so secure in their judgment, so confident in their assessment of his worthlessness, that they never once thought to look deeper. They never wondered where he was going every day, or why his car was never at the apartment during working hours. He was a ghost to them, a problem that had conveniently removed itself. This invisibility was his greatest asset. While the Davenports were busy planning a lavish party to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Davenport Industries, an event that was to be the social highlight of the season, Alex and his team were preparing for a different kind of launch. The Helios project was now a behemoth, a fully funded, city-approved, multi-billion-dollar development. The photovoltaic glass from Germany was being manufactured. The contracts with construction firms were being finalized. The marketing team Sterling had hired was crafting a media blitz design for maximum impact. They worked in a sealed environment, all employees and contractors bound by ironclad, non-disclosure agreements. The project was referred to only by a code name in all official documents, Project Dawn. The night before the Davenports' anniversary party, Alex stood alone in the Ethelred office, looking out the large arched window at the city skyline. It was late. The office was quiet, the desks empty, but a low hum of energy seemed to linger in the air. On the central table, the architectural model of the Helios project was now fully illuminated from within, a glowing beacon of the future. In 18 months, he had gone from being fired and humiliated to being the head of a company that was about to change this city forever. He felt a profound sense of calm. There was no vengeful glee, no burning desire to see his wife and her family punished. There was only a quiet, steely resolve to see his vision through, to let his work speak for itself. He had accepted that his marriage was over. He had mourned the woman he thought he had married. Now all that was left was the truth. He thought of Clara, likely at her parents' mansion, overseeing the final preparations for the party. She would be in her element, directing florists and caterers, ensuring every detail was perfect for the grand display of Davenport's success. She would be surrounded by people who reinforced her worldview, who measured a person's worth by their net worth, their title, their connections. It was a world built on surfaces, and tomorrow, the surface was about to crack. He picked up a single, beautifully printed invitation from his desk. It was for the Davenport party. Clara had sent it to his new address via courier, a gesture that was less an invitation and more a final, pitying summons. Perhaps a night among successful people will inspire you, the attached note had read. He ran his thumb over the embossed Davenport crest. He would go. It was time for the architect to show his work. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the old moleskine notebook. He flipped through the early pages, the first rough sketches of the Helios Towers, the scribbled notes from late nights filled with doubt and determination. It had all started here. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. It was a symbolic object, a reminder of where he had come from, a quiet testament to the fact that the biggest things often have the quietest beginnings. The storm was coming. The quiet was almost over. The grand ballroom of the Oakwood Country Club was a glittering spectacle of manufactured importance. A sea of tuxedos and designer gowns flowed beneath chandeliers that dripped with 1,000 crystal tears. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of forced laughter. At the center of it all, holding court like royalty, were the Davenports. Richard, expansive and beaming, accepted congratulations on his company's 40 years of ruthless profiteering. Eleanor, draped in diamonds, glided through the crowd, a queen surveying her domain. Marcus was already several glasses of champagne into the evening, loudly recounting a recent business triumph to a circle of sycophants. And Clara was radiant. She wore a stunning silver gown that shimmered under the lights, her expression one of perfect, confident poise. She was the picture of success, the daughter of the man of the hour, the beautiful wife of... Well, no one was quite sure what to make of that anymore. When Alex arrived, his entrance went almost unnoticed. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored dark suit, but he carried himself with a new, quiet authority that made him seem out of place, like a panther that had wandered into a poodle show. He took a glass of water from a passing waiter and found a discreet position near the back of the room, content to observe. He saw Clara spot him. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face, quickly replaced by a look of weary resignation. She excused herself from a conversation and made her way toward him, her movements a study in reluctant duty. "Alex, you came," she said, her tone making it clear she wished he hadn't. "Try not to look so morose. People will talk." "I'm not morose, Clara. I'm just watching," he replied. "Well, don't. It's creepy. Go mingle. Try make a good impression for once. My father's most important clients are here. For my sake, please, just pretend to be normal for one night." She didn't wait for a reply, turning on her heel and rejoining a more important conversation. Alex watched her go. Pretend to be normal. It was a fitting final instruction from her. The evening wore on, a pageant of speeches and toasts. Finally, Richard Davenport took the stage, his face flushed with pride and champagne. He stood at a podium flanked by two enormous screens that were currently displaying the Davenport Industries logo. 40 years, he began, his voice booming through the sound system. 40 years of innovation, of strength, of building a legacy for my family, for this city. He launched into a long, self-congratulatory speech, hitting all the expected notes of hard work and vision, conveniently omitting the hostile takeovers and brutal downsizing that had paved his path to success. As Richard droned on, Alex quietly took out his phone. He sent a single, pre-written text message. Now, miles away, in a sleek downtown office, a public relations executive hit send on an email that would instantly distribute a press release to every major news outlet in the country. On stage, Richard was reaching his crescendo, and the future of Davenport Industries has never been brighter. We are on the verge of securing a partnership in the most ambitious urban renewal this city has ever seen. It was at that precise moment that the screens behind him flickered. The Davenport logo vanished, replaced by the breaking news banner of a national business channel. The sound in the ballroom cut out, replaced by the urgent, clipped tones of a news anchor. "We are interrupting this program with major breaking news from the world of architecture and real estate," the anchor's voice announced, filling the suddenly silent room. "Details are just emerging about a revolutionary new development set to transform the city's long-derelict western waterfront. It's called the Helios Project, and sources are calling it the most significant and technologically advanced sustainable development in the world." A murmur went through the crowd. Richard stared, bewildered, at the screen behind him. On the screen, stunning 3D renderings began to play. Images of elegant, soaring towers covered in shimmering photovoltaic glass, connected by lush green sky bridges, surrounded by parks and public spaces. It was a vision of a utopian future, and it was breathtaking. The project is the brainchild of a mysterious new firm, Ethelred Designs, the anchor continued. For months, the identity of the firm's founder has been a closely guarded secret. But we can now confirm the architect behind this multi-billion-dollar vision. The screen changed, showing a professional headshot. It was a picture of Alex. He looked calm, confident, and visionary. A simple caption appeared below it: "Alexander Vance, founder and lead architect, Ethelred Designs." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a dense, heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that precedes a cataclysm. Every single head in the room slowly turned, as if pulled by an invisible string, away from the screens and toward the back of the room. They turned toward the quiet man in the simple dark suit who was still standing by the wall, holding a glass of water. They turned toward Alex. The quietest man in the room had just made the loudest possible sound. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the news anchor's voice continuing to detail the staggering scale of the Helios project, the investment capital secured, the technological innovations, the projected economic impact. It was a tidal wave of information, and it washed over the frozen tableau in the ballroom. Alex watched as hundreds of faces registered shock, then disbelief, then a dawning, horrified understanding. He saw Richard Davenport, on stage, his face slack, his triumphant speech forgotten. He saw Eleanor, her hand frozen halfway to her diamond necklace, her mouth slightly agape. He saw Marcus, his smug smirk wiped clean, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed confusion. And he saw Clara. She stood rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on his. The color had drained from her face, leaving her silver dress to mock her with its brilliance. In her eyes, he saw the entire artifice of her world collapsing in on itself. Then, the spell broke. A low buzz started, a hum of whispers that quickly grew into a roar of conversation. People were turning to each other, pointing, pulling out their phones. The news was spreading through the room like wildfire. The man they had dismissed, pitted, and ignored, the failure, the charity case, was the architect of the most important project the city had seen in a century. Alex remained perfectly still, letting the moment land, letting the truth settle in the room like a fine layer of dust. He had planned this. Every detail, the timing, the venue, the audience. He had chosen to let the revelation happen here, in the heart of their temple of status, on the night of their greatest self-congratulation. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of truth. Slowly, deliberately, he began to walk forward. The crowd parted for him as if he were a prophet, a silent, stunned corridor forming in his path. He walked past the shocked faces of the city's elite, people who wouldn't have given him the time of day an hour ago, who were now staring at him with a mixture of awe and terror. He walked toward the stage, toward the family that had condemned him. As he approached, Clara seemed to break out of her trance. She took a step toward him, her hand outstretched. "Alex," she began, her voice a choked whisper. He didn't stop. He didn't look at her. He walked past her as if she were a stranger and stepped up onto the stage, taking the podium from her father, who stumbled back, looking utterly lost. Alex stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. The room fell silent once more, waiting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every ear was straining to hear him. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and clear, amplified by the microphone. "My name is Alexander Vance. For the last 18 months, some of you in this room, in fact, most of you, have known me as a failure." He let the word hang in the air, the same word Clara had used at the dinner table, but now it sounded absurd, an artifact from a forgotten reality. He turned his head slightly and looked at his wife and her family, who were now clustered together at the side of the stage like shipwreck survivors. "I was told I lacked killer instinct," he said, his eyes meeting Richard's. "That being thoughtful was a weakness. I was told my ideas were doodles in a notebook, a little hobby." His gaze shifted to Marcus, who flinched as if struck. "I was offered a cubicle, so I could have a sense of purpose." He looked at Eleanor, whose face had crumpled into a mask of horrified regret. "And I was told by my own wife that I was an embarrassment, that I should give up my fantasy project and get a real job." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. This was his list of grievances, delivered not with anger, but with the cold, hard clarity of fact. "You see, you all judged me based on a very narrow definition of success. You value appearances over substance, titles over talent, and conformity over courage. You looked at me when I lost my job, and you saw a man who had fallen. You never once stopped to consider that I might have jumped." He looked directly at Clara now. The connection between them was electric, a current of 18 months of unspoken truths. You told me integrity doesn't pay the mortgage. You were wrong. It turns out integrity, when combined with vision and relentless hard work, can build cities." He turned back to the audience. "The Helios Project is not just about buildings. It's about building a better future. It's about proving that sustainable, human-centered design isn't just a fantasy. It's the only viable path forward." And it was born not in a corporate boardroom, but in a quiet room by a man you all wrote off. So, I'll leave you with a thought. He leaned into the microphone. Be careful who you call a failure. The quiet ones, the thoughtful ones, the ones who refuse to play your game. They're the ones who are busy changing the world while you are busy congratulating yourselves. He stepped back from the podium. The silence held for a beat, and then the room erupted, not in applause, but in a chaotic frenzy of people rushing toward him, their faces a mixture of opportunism and disbelief. The confrontation was over. The fallout was just beginning. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The party, Richard Davenport's crowning achievement, disintegrated into a frantic scramble for information and proximity to Alex. Business leaders who had looked straight through him earlier were now shoving their cards into his hands, their faces plastered with sycophantic smiles. Reporters who had been covering the party as a society event were now shouting questions at him, their phones held aloft like offerings. Through it all, Alex remained an island of calm. By his side, suddenly, was James Sterling, a broad, powerfully built man whose presence alone seemed to create a protective bubble. He had slipped in unnoticed during the speech and now stood shoulder to shoulder with Alex. "Time to go, my friend," Sterling murmured, his voice a low rumble. "We've made our point." He guided Alex through the grasping hands and flashing cameras, clearing a path toward a side exit. As they reached the door, a hand grabbed Alex's arm. It was Clara. Her face was a wreck of conflicting emotions, shock, desperation, and a dawning, terrible fear. "Alex, wait. We need to talk," she pleaded, her voice barely audible over the din. Alex stopped and looked at her. He saw not a partner, but a stranger desperate to reclaim a status she had just discovered she'd lost. "There's nothing to talk about, Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He gently removed her hand from his arm. "You made your choice a long time ago." "No, I didn't know," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "You never told me. If I had known, if you had known I was going to be successful, you would have treated me differently?" he asked, the question a quiet balm. "Is that it? Your support, your loyalty, it's all conditional, dependent on my stock price?" He shook his head slowly. "That's the difference between us, Clara. I didn't need you to believe in my success. I just needed you to believe in me." He turned and walked out the door with Sterling, leaving her standing alone in the doorway as the world she had known crumbled behind her. The fallout for the Davenports was swift and brutal. The story was irresistible. The scorned son-in-law, the secret visionary, the public humiliation of the arrogant elite. It was on every news channel, every blog, every social media feed. But the damage went far beyond social embarrassment. In his speech, Richard had boasted of being on the verge of a partnership in the city's new urban renewal project. He had been referring to the Helios Project. He had been lobbying city officials for months, using his influence to try and get the inside track, never knowing who was behind it. Now, it came out that his company, Davenport Industries, had submitted an unsolicited, aggressive bid to be the primary material supplier, a bid that had been unceremoniously rejected by Ethelred Designs weeks earlier for failing to meet their stringent environmental standards. The press painted him as not just arrogant, but incompetent, a man completely out of touch with the future of his own industry. His investors panicked. The company's stock, which had been stagnant for years, began to plummet. Clients, spooked by the public relations disaster and the sudden perception that Davenport Industries was a relic of the past, began to pull their contracts. Marcus, whose position as VP was entirely dependent on his father's reputation, found himself ostracized. The colleagues who had once fawned over him now avoided his calls. Within weeks, he was quietly forced to resign in a desperate attempt by the board to stop the bleeding. The Davenports were trapped in a prison of their own making. Their obsession with appearances, with what people thought, was now working against them. The whispers at the country club were no longer about Alex's failure, but about their own. They had become the cautionary tale. They were the ones receiving the pitying looks. The reversal of fortune was absolute, a perfect, poetic inversion of their own cruelty. The moral mirror Alex had held up to them at the party had not been taken down. It now followed them everywhere, reflecting their own shallowness back at them in every newspaper headline and every averted gaze. A few months after the party, the dust had begun to settle, revealing a radically altered landscape. The shell of the Davenports' opulent life remained, but it was hollowed out, decaying from the inside. Richard had been forced to step down as CEO of the company he had built, replaced by a crisis management team that was selling off assets to keep it from collapsing entirely. He and Eleanor had become recluses, the shame too great to face their former social circle. Marcus was unemployed and unemployable, his name a liability. The entire foundation of their identity, their wealth, their status, their perceived superiority, had been built on sand, and the tide of truth had washed it all away. Clara was living in a small, rented apartment, a place that would have once seemed impossibly beneath her. She had been forced to sell her car, her jewelry, the artifacts of a life she had taken for granted. She had tried to reach Alex several times, leaving a string of increasingly desperate voicemails. He never answered. He had filed for divorce the day after the party, a clean, swift action handled by Sterling's lawyers. There was nothing to contest. The house was his, and he had no interest in any of their former shared assets. He wanted nothing from her but his freedom. One afternoon, she showed up at the Ethelred Designs office. She had gotten past the lobby security by using her married name, a name she was about to lose. Alex, seeing her on the security monitor, agreed to see her for 5 minutes. He met her in the lobby, not wanting to bring her into the vibrant, creative space he had built. She looked smaller, diminished. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple, anonymous attire. The confident, icy poise had been replaced by a raw, naked desperation. "Alex, please," she began, her voice trembling. "You have to listen to me. I was wrong. I was a fool. I was blinded by the way I was raised, by everything my father taught me to value." Alex listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He felt a flicker of pity for her, but it was distant, like a memory of a long-extinguished fire. "I love you," she said, the words sounding foreign and clumsy in her mouth. "I know I didn't show it. I know I failed you, but I see it now. I see you. Can't we start again? I can change. I want to be the woman you deserve." He let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke, his voice soft but unyielding. "The time for that is over, Clara. This isn't about punishing you. I take no joy in what has happened to your family. But you're right, you were blinded. You were blinded by a system of values that is completely alien to me, and you never once tried to see the world through my eyes. You only ever demanded that I see it through yours." He took a step back, creating a definitive space between them. "The problem wasn't the money, Clara. It was never about the money. It was about respect. It was about character. You thought my character was a liability. It turns out it's the most valuable asset I have." He looked at her one last time. "I truly hope you find a new way to live, a way to value things that can't be bought or sold. But you have to do it on your own. My path is here." He gestured vaguely toward the bustling office behind the glass doors. "And it's a path I have to walk alone." He turned and walked back into his office, leaving her standing in the lobby with the ruins of their marriage. It was the last time he ever saw her. He didn't look back. He was moving forward toward the skyline he was about to build. A year after the revelation at the party, the world looked very different. The cover of Forbes magazine showed a picture of Alexander Vance. He was standing on a high floor of a half-finished skyscraper, the skeletal framework of the Helios project rising around him against a brilliant blue sky. He wasn't smiling a wide, triumphant grin, but a small, content smile. The headline read, "The Quiet Architect, How Alexander Vance is Building Tomorrow's World." The article inside was a deep dive into his philosophy of human-centered capitalism, his commitment to sustainability, and his belief that a company's true value lay in its positive impact on society. not just its bottom line. He was no longer just a successful architect. He had become a thought leader, an inspiration. His life had found a new, fulfilling rhythm. Ethelred Designs was thriving, attracting the brightest minds in architecture and engineering from around the world, all eager to work on a project with a purpose. He had sold the minimalist house he had once shared with Clara, the sale of which he quietly funneled into a charitable foundation he established to fund scholarships for underprivileged architecture students. He lived in a comfortable but not ostentatious apartment overlooking the park, a space filled with books, plants, and the warm clutter of a life well lived. He had found a new partner, a landscape architect named Sarah, who worked with him on the Helios project. Their connection wasn't built on status or ambition, but on a shared passion for creating beautiful, sustainable spaces and a deep, mutual respect. Their conversations were about ideas, not appearances, about possibilities, not limitations. He rarely thought of the Davenports. He heard through the grapevine that Richard and Eleanor had retired to a small community in another state, their fortune and reputation gone. Marcus was reportedly working in a low-level sales job, the ultimate humiliation for a man who had once been a vice president. And Clara, he had heard, had gone back to school to study art history, the passion she had abandoned to fit into her family's world. He hoped she had found some measure of peace, some new way of defining her own worth. His victory had not made him cruel. It had reinforced his core belief in integrity. He had won not by stooping to their level, but by rising above it, by proving that a foundation built on character was stronger than any empire built on arrogance. One evening, he and Sarah were walking through the construction site of the Helios Project Central Plaza. The sun was setting, casting long shadows from the rising towers. The air was filled with the sounds of creation. He paused and looked up at the soaring structure, the physical manifestation of a dream he had once sketched in a simple notebook. He felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey had been painful. The humiliation had been real. But it had been a necessary fire, one that had burned away everything that wasn't essential, leaving him with a clear, unshakable sense of who he was and what he was meant to build. The pain had been the crucible in which his true self had been forged. What a journey, right? It just goes to show you that true strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about the quiet, relentless pursuit of your vision, even when nobody else can see it. It's about having a core of integrity that no amount of scorn or dismissal can break. Alex's story reminds us that our worth isn't determined by someone else's opinion or their narrow definition of success. It's defined by our character, our resilience, and the positive impact we strive to make on the world. What do you think is the most important lesson from Alex's story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content that celebrates the underdog and the power of the human spirit. Thanks for being here with me today. Until next time, keep building your own vision.